When you live in the South, you get exposed to the remnants of the Civil War, so much that you don't realize how adjusted you become to it. Every once in a while, there's a Confederate statue that is removed, and it will remind me of how contentious it is. A Sunday drive through the natural state will quickly escort you past Confederate flags, zip-tied to fences, and dangling above doors to houses. You're almost guaranteed to see a one-off vehicle with a sticker displayed, "Don't tread on me," a symbol that was created to support the southern states withdrawing from the Union. It was created by Christopher Gadsden, a documented slave owner. The rattlesnake drawing is the same that was used in the correspondence of soldiers in the Confederate Army. Past the memorial markers of battlefields and plantation wedding venues and a much deeper part of history that shaped where we are now, slavery was not only allowed at one point, but it was something planters were willing to fight for. One of the most common defensive stances quoted in the South is that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about property rights. It sounds convincing enough on the surface, but when you realize what the property was, you can see that the argument is one and the same. When a boy like Wiley Jones could be sold along with the furniture and candlestick holders, it's a blatant statement that black people weren't seen as having any more personhood than the kitchen table. It's a very uncomfortable thing to think about. You have this young man, his siblings, his mother, all going up for auction, each one of them a victim of circumstances. I wonder at how they were motivated to keep going. This is something I'm vastly unqualified to talk about. But that is a clear indicator that I need the expertise of the most knowledgeable scholars and to dig into research for what documents still remain of that time. Dr. Sharice Jones Branch, Dean of Liberal Arts at the Communication of Arkansas State University, was willing to help me fill in the gaps of this story.
I think it was dangerous and precarious a lot of the time. If you're talking about 1848 when he was born, of course, there are increasing tensions over the institution of slavery. The other part of it, and I think it's very important in telling these stories to make sure we empower Black people. Black people are pushing back against the institution of slavery. They're not waiting on a war. They're not waiting on abolitionists. They're self-emancipating themselves. This is a point in history when restrictions, prohibitions on Black lives are getting even tighter, which suggests what? That they're pushing back against the system. So I think for a lot of them, things are getting increasingly dangerous because they're pushing back against the system, but they're also getting dangerous because I think people understand that there's a change on the horizon. And we see that as we move closer to the Civil War, and then the nation finds itself embroiled in the Civil War. And I think there are also questions and concerns about what is going to happen at the end of this war and how is this going to change the very nature and the fabric of American life as people have known it for a really long time.
Dr. Brian Rogers from the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center had this to say about the political system leading up to the Civil War.
So we have to look at the kind of the history of the party system in the United States. The Democratic Party, prior to the advent of the Civil War, was the pro-slavery party. They were the party. They were the conservative party, right? They wanted to maintain the status quo. Their chief rival was the Whig Party, which was the pro-business party. But the Whig Party began to split over the issue of slavery, and the Republican Party emerges out of that turmoil with the purpose of preventing the further spread of slavery in the country, and finally establishing the platform of eliminating slavery in the United States. The very first presidential campaign that the Republican Party appears is the 1860 election where Lincoln won. The South knew that if Lincoln won, that the Republican Party's plan was to eliminate slavery. Lincoln did not appear on any ballots in the South, yet he still won the election. And immediately following Lincoln's election as president, Southern states, starting with South Carolina, began to secede from the Union. In 1861, Fountain Pitts Yale joins the Confederate Army and goes away to fight in the Civil War. Now, because Wiley Jones is owned at that moment by Fountain Pitts Yale, Wiley Jones is forced to be Yale's camp servant. So he travels around the country with Fountain Pitts Yale and the Confederate Army, and he serves his master while he's away at war. It's interesting that there is this narrative that sometimes comes out about Black Confederate soldiers. And this is often these people who have been identified as Black Confederate soldiers were often camp servants or enslaved men that were forced to serve the cause of the Confederacy. They often built camps, dug trenches, built encampments, did all of the things that were needed for the Confederate Army to continue the war effort without being allowed to fight. Even in the beginning, African Americans who ran away from slavery and joined the Union's war effort were not allowed to fight. They had to do these same labor tasks, building encampments, fortifications, serving officers, cooking food, tending to the animals. These were the tasks that they were given during the war effort.
I sat with Mark Christ, a local expert on the history of the Civil War. He's been published, interviewed, and quoted more times than I can keep track of when researching online.
So when when Lincoln was elected in 1860, the state had a secession convention to decide whether or not to join the other slave states in leaving the Union. And one of the interesting things about that is that the majority of the people who were selected as delegates to the convention were Unionists in their sympathies, and in fact, the convention did not vote to secede initially because the Unionist majority decided to wait. What they decided to do was meet again later in the year, unless something happened that would cause them to come together sooner. Well, something happened. It was the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, including some from Arkansas, and the convention met again at that point and voted to secede from the Union. There were 4 people who voted against secession. The head of the convention asked that they change their votes to make it unanimous that Arkansas was going as a unit, and all but one, Isaac Murphy from Madison County, changed their vote. But Murphy, who would later become the Unionist governor of Arkansas, refused to change his vote. So that kind of reflects some of the social turmoil that was going on in Arkansas at the time. There were a lot of secessionists, but there was also a large number of people who remained loyal to the Union throughout the war. In fact, Arkansas had more than 15,000 people who fought for Union regiments that were raised in the state. 10,000 of those were white. 5,526 were African Americans who served in United States Colored Troops units. So that there was that split from the beginning. Also, socially, a lot of those who favored secession were slave owners, and most of the slavery, most of the slave plantations were along the Arkansas, and the Red rivers. So that affected, what areas tended to be the most pro Confederate.
Something that I wanted to have answered sooner than later was whether or not the Civil War was about slavery.
If there had not been slavery, there would not have been a civil war. I mean, it was the country's original sin. There was no way that that a system that was built on the labor of enslaved people could survive into into the modern era. There, a lot of folks will say, "Oh, it was tariffs and things like that," but we would not have fought a civil war over tariffs. It came down to the peculiar institution, as they called it. We could not live to our original promise as a country with slavery.
Mark shared some information that I had never heard or learned about in history class.
Actually, one of the things that a lot of folks, just general knowledge don't know is that there were black soldiers and sailors in the Civil War, and hundreds of thousands of them. And Lincoln called them the most available but unavailed resource that the Union had. And during the sesquicentennial of the Civil War back, Lord, it's been 10 years now. But I did a number of talks at high schools, about the black soldiers in the war, and it's all these kids, just I'd never heard that, and it's just a very important part of American history and Arkansas history. Another thing is the degree of unionism in the seceded states. As I mentioned earlier, in Arkansas, there were 10,000 white men who served in federal units during the war. And there was unionism from the start. In 1861, there was a secret organization in the Ozarks called the Arkansas Peace Society, that were folks who were opposed to secession. They their main thing was they just wanted to be left alone, in the mountains, and they were rounded up and brought to Little Rock, and a lot of them were given the choice of join the Confederate Army or face trial, and a lot of them joined the Confederate Army, under duress. And the irony is that those folks who faced trial were freed because the state court said, well, we don't have a law that they violated. And those men who joined the Confederate Army, there was a unit of them at the Battle of Shiloh who were put in front with the ranks behind them, telling them if they try to run, shoot them down. Well, those men who survived Confederate service generally later deserted, and would many if not all of them would end up in Union units in Arkansas and Missouri.
Who were they serving? How is it that they ended up in those locations? I mean, you're assuming that they did this willingly when that probably was not, and more than likely, that was not the case. They were taken to these environments to serve in the roles that they had on plantations and farms, and what have you. So that's what I mean when I talk about the ways that we have to complicate a narrative, right? It's not enough to say, well, they were there too. What were they doing and how did they get there in the first place? Number one. And number two, have you ever speculated about how they felt about being in those spaces? Because they're not unintelligent. They know what's going on. They understand why these battles are being fought and why there's a war in the first place. So how do you think they felt about that?
I did I edited a collection of letters back, it's been almost 25 years now, but from a soldier in the First Arkansas Infantry Regiment, who wrote home regularly to his family in Clark County, and just about every letter that he wrote, he was asked his father, "Please send me a Negro boy to work for me in the camp." Though that never happened, and he was eventually killed in battle at the Battle of Franklin.
Dr. Najee K. Baptist, assistant professor of political science at the University of Arkansas, had even more to add to this.
I think the Civil War within itself, broadly speaking, is probably one of the most under examined psychological phenomena, socio-political and psychological phenomena. We understand that a war happened and people were shooting guns and people died on each side, right? But it was family member versus family members, right? And again, what, as Frederick Douglass says, what to the Negro is the 4th of July? What is independent? What were they fighting for? They were fighting for some sort of state of Stockholm syndrome. Your captives become people that you have to protect, and you don't even know, because the shaping of identity. There is no self-identity. You've already been defined as a tool for whatever that person wants you to be. Your labor is exploited. Your mind is only used at their disposal. And so now they're telling you that your body.
Fountain Pitch Yale was killed in the battle at Mount Pleasant.
When Fountain Pitts Yale died in battle in Louisiana, Wiley Jones was sent back to the Yale family property.
Fountain Pitch Yale was killed in the battle at Mount Pleasant, Louisiana in 1863. We'll check that date again, okay? Okay. After Fountain Pitch Yale was killed, Wiley Jones, who was just a teenager, wanted to reunite with his family. Now, his family, who was living at Pine Bluff at the outbreak of the war, by the middle of the war, 1862, 1863, had been taken to Waco, Texas by the Yale family. This was often the case with enslaved people who lived in Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana. As the Union Army made its way across the South, enslavers, slave owners, Confederate sympathizers, Confederate governments attempted to escape into Texas on their way to Mexico. It was the case here in Arkansas. The Confederate government left Little Rock and attempted to escape to Texas, setting up a provincial government in Old Washington, Arkansas, in Hempstead County. There was a large number of Confederates who eventually made their way into Texas through Mexico and settling in Brazil. The Yale family was attempting to escape the Union Army by making their way to Waco, Texas. Now, after the death of Fountain Pitch Yale, Wiley Jones finally makes his way to Waco, Texas, a 13, 14-year-old boy traveling to reunite with his family from Louisiana across eastern Texas all the way to Waco, Texas. And he finally reunites with his family, and by this point, the war has ended. The Confederacy has been defeated. The enslaved have been emancipated with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the enslaved that were living in states and territories that were in open rebellion to the United States.
James Yale was one of the biggest supporters of Arkansas seceding from the war, but something had changed in the time that Wiley had been away. According to a few Civil War history buff forums, James Yale was serving in the state militia as a major general. He had written a law to create a state military board to build up defenses because he knew there wasn't much of a chance that Arkansas would stand against the Union soldiers as they were. It's important to note that the troops that Yale commanded were not part of the official Confederate troops, but under an independent force of Arkansas. James Yale wanted to remain independent and encourage his troops to vote against entering the Confederate service. Most didn't listen, and they voted to join the Confederate Army, which took them away from the post in Arkansas, leaving the state nearly defenseless. The military board opted to remove Yale from command since he opposed the Confederate transfer. He and his family fled to Texas, bringing Wiley's siblings along with them. He represented the other Union sympathizers and continued to oppose the Confederates. All the while, his son was fighting in that very same army in a war that resulted in Fountain Pitts Yale's death. There's quite a bit of lore built around how Wiley got to Waco. There's a tombstone in Louisiana where Fountain Pitts Yale was killed in action. There's also a tombstone in Waco. Some believe that Wiley Jones brought the body of Fountain Pitts Yale back to the family in Texas, while others believe that the tombstone in Waco is a memorial. It's a bit of a mystery where the body actually was buried. The Civil War was ending, and it was clear that the Union had won. In September of 1862, President Abraham Lincoln sent out a message to Confederate states that they had 100 days to join the Union on their own free will, or else he would free their slaves. News traveled a little slower in those days, but plantation owners saw the writing on the wall and began fleeing through Texas to Mexico and down to Brazil with their lives. The southern states denied the request to join the Union, and so the Emancipation Proclamation was enforced by January. Here was Wiley, with his siblings once again wondering if a document he heard about was going to set him free, or the rug was about to be pulled out from underneath him. Independence or servitude was a coin flip bet. The teenage boy born into a world that didn't record a birth certificate and treated him like an animal was possibly about to see his freedom in that same world. Wiley saw an opportunity and dreamed of what he would do if he was a respected citizen of that new United States of America. This limited podcast series is produced by the Arkansas Podcast Collaborative, a nonprofit organization with a mission to advance diverse podcast programming starting in its home state of Arkansas. This podcast is produced, written, edited, and narrated by Ty King. This podcast was made possible by the Curtis H. Sykes Memorial Grant, supporting projects that preserve, commemorate, and enhance the heritage of African Americans in Arkansas. Funding is administered by the Black History Commission of Arkansas and funded by the Arkansas General Assembly through Arkansas State Archives. If you want to hear the entire epic tale of Wiley Jones, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and watch the video format on YouTube. You can find links on all the platforms on our website at arkansaspodcasters.org/Wiley Jones.